Assalamu alaikum and hello everyone. It's great to be back on another session of Talking Books. My name is Taiba Abbas and I'm the founder of Ala Books and Authors. And today I'm going to be in conversation with Saba Karim, who is the author of Skyfall. And I'm going to grab this chance to flash my copy of her book. So it's this beautiful thing right here. Welcome, Saba. It's great to see you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Taiba. Such a delight to see you and to be having this chat with you. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. It's a bigger pleasure for me. And I'm going to introduce you through your book. So,
sure.
Saba Karim is an author, award-winning filmmaker and educator whose writing has appeared in The Guardian, The Independent, Huffington Post, Dawn, The Friday Times, Express Tribune, among many other publications. She has read social anthropology at the University of Oxford and works at NYU Abu Dhabi. Before joining the academy, she worked as country marketing and public affairs head at Citigroup. So, Saba, I want to begin with what I consider to be a very, very important part of a book, the dedication. Because, a dedication tends to carry a story of its own, which, pretty much makes the book what it is, right? So Skyfall is a dedication to your father. And underneath it, there's a poem by Hausman. So could you talk a bit about that?
Yeah, Tayyiba, first of all, thank you for asking that question. I almost feel like it doesn't get asked enough. And I can only really second what you've said, that for me, I think thinking carefully and being mindful about who the book was dedicated to and kind of what goes into the dedication was almost as front and center as the material in the book. So thanks a lot for that. It is dedicated to my father, Taiba, and I think the story with that is that he was a professor of English literature, and for the 25 years of my life that he was alive, he would always talk to us about these 3 books that he had scripted in his mind, so whether that was at a dining table conversation, whether that was on a school run. And I think had he had a lot of material possession, he would trade it for the prospect of having a published book, So I think growing up somewhere for my siblings and myself, as we would listen to those stories, about the books, but also about literature and shairi more generally, I think somewhere our own ambitions and our literary dreams became very intimately bound with Abu's. And so I think I knew that this was kind of a song I was carrying with me. But today when I see it like on a bookshelf or I see it published, I guess like it's just a very tiny, a very humble attempt to try and fulfill this rather big dream that he had. So I think it's very hard to talk about the dedication without talking about him. And then the poem, I'm so glad it's actually the first time I'm talking about that in a book talk or an interview. So that's very special. But again, Tayyiba, this is a poem that Abu used to recite to us as we were growing up, to my siblings and me. And I think like my brother was the one who suggested I put it in the dedication, because I think the spirit of it really symbolizes what happened with me, vis-a-vis my own father, as far as the book goes, which is to say, when you say, when first my way to fare, I took few pence in purse had I, and long I used to stand and stare at things I could not buy. And now times have changed. If I care to buy a thing, I can. Here's the fare and here's the pence, but where's the lost young man? I think for me, the significance of that is that today, when the book is out, when it's published, all of that is done, and he's not here. I think just the looming of that loss, it kind of just feels a lot larger than life. And so I think even the day once Bloomsbury had published, it was all out. It was a very bittersweet moment because it's been several years, but there was still this haunting realization that this feels a little bit misplaced, So I think there's the power and a poignancy to that, and I feel Skyfall is a big tribute to him. So thank you for asking me that.
It's a beautiful tribute, really. So I remember when I bought your book, I think it was a month back or 2 months back, I'm not sure. I loved how you referred to it as your song. And I'm quite familiar with the anecdote behind it. I think that that incident or that interaction with a certain person that got you thinking or got you started on this journey. But my question to you is about music. And I think it was Moravia who said that a novel is like a musical composition, and that is something that really emanates from the pages of your novel. And I think, and those who have read it, they would know that, music and singing runs like a vein through the story, and it kind of, rises to a grand crescendo towards the end, right?
Yeah.
So, and for someone who writes to music, I mean, I'm really curious to know, is music a part of your writing or creative process?
Yeah, well, what a beautiful question, Taiba. I feel like, I'd also, I think, once heard, maybe it was, I can't remember, maybe it was Salman Rushdie who had said that, there's a lyricality to writing, whether it's prose or any other form. And so I completely second what you've said about that. And yes, I think music underpins my writing journey in several ways. I think the first thing is that it just helps me to create and to imagine the world that I'm trying to build. You may or may not know it in an obvious way. It may have more kind of subliminal undertones, but I feel it opens me up to feelings. It's very immersive in that sense. And in some ways, even more so when it's music that is in my own language, or let me say, in a language other than English. Sometimes, I feel like there's a resonance and a power that has, but somehow it allows me to really immerse into this zone of deep concentration, and it almost feels like your imagination in some ways is on steroids, or it's just been boosted when you're listening to a song. And it's funny we're talking about this, because I feel when I think back to Skyfall and the writing journey, with so many of the chapters and so many of these luminous moments that are there, I feel there are particular songs that maybe I was listening to at the time, and they've got such a strong power of transportation or just association, if you will. And I really feel like in that way they form the spine to my storytelling journey. So I think in that sense, music and my writing are very inextricably linked. But I think the other thing, Taiba, that's important to also talk about is that I think music, as you said, is also front and center to the story in many ways. And that was important because whilst the book speaks to so many issues of, like almost to this human pyramid, which is characterized by race and class and, gender and religion and what you will, but I feel I was desperately searching for some kind of prop which was going to work against that, as a foil to that, and say, what can offer a universal language? What can really transcend some of these man-made borders and boundaries that we have? And so I think it doesn't matter to me, like so much of the poetry here is in Urdu. And I know my readers are not all familiar with that language, but I think there's a power that music has which allows it to work agnostic to these things. And so I think the closest analogy, Taiba, that I can draw, which I've been thinking about more recently with the process, but with the book itself, is that when I listen to a powerful piece of music, when I listen to, say, something that is like a Sufi song, it's complex and it's messy and it's chaotic. And yet, so if I'm listening to an Abda Parveen, or I'm listening to like a Nayara Noor or something like that, it's complex and it's chaotic, and yet I can distill from it the simplicity of like a folk song. And I think that's what my process is like, and that's why music is very, very salient for me.
Wonderful, wonderful. But I need to ask this next question. Could you share a bit of your playlist? Any songs, any particular songs you were listening to while writing Skyfall?
Yeah, I think, Taiba, I was listening to a lot of Faiz's poetry. Some of it, again, so most of it, a lot of it was Urdu music, but I was listening to a lot of Faiz's poetry, which specifically the stuff that's been sung by Nayara Noor, because I find her voice to be powerful, but also strangely raw. And she sounds like she's someone who was comfortable enough to expose that vulnerability. So I don't know, I find it haunting, and I find it very, very raw in that sense. And so that's something that I listened to throughout. And I feel like some way, probably in ways more subtle than apparent, it's made its way into the book.
Mm-hmm. No, definitely. definitely. And thank you for answering that.
Of course.
But so, self-censorship becomes a bit of a reflex especially when you're a Pakistani female author, right? So how do you negotiate that space? Or does living away from Pakistan change your relationship to your work?
Yeah. I mean, I think it's just baggage that is very hard to untie. It's been with us through our years growing up, but I think now, as someone who wants to tell a story across any medium, it comes with the territory, I suppose, and starting from the cover of the book that you shared, Taiba, I think it's interesting, anecdotally speaking, one of the earliest responses that I got to the cover when it was out online was that, and it was very, very strange for me because it was also new, but somebody said something like, you need to change this font immediately because it's Allah written backwards or something like that. And there was this very vociferous reaction to saying it's not okay. And it's kind of, it's borderline blasphemous or whatever. And of course, then you slowly realize that this is how it kind of goes. But I think I would be insincere if I wasn't bringing up the nervousness that you feel as a writer or a storyteller when you're touching upon things like which will potentially make people uncomfortable. So whether that's in my book, talk of violence against women, whether it's sexual orientation, whether it's pushing back against people who we see as these gatekeepers of dogma and purity and religion. So of course you feel there's imminent backlash, which can take a variety of forms. So from a ban to a threat to trolling, and that's never very nice to be on the receiving end on. So I don't want to sit on this talk today and pretend like, oh no, I've kind of moved ahead of that. You're of course afraid of those things. And I think Taiba, as a woman, that troublemaker label gets really amplified, So I definitely think about those things. But funnily, I also think that the novel, although a lot of people feel it's a medium that's extinct and it's not very widely read anymore, I feel it gives you this platform where you can weave reality with fiction. And so, you can talk about things that agitate you, that bother you, but you can do it in a manner which doesn't set out to provoke necessarily, if that makes sense, and you're not peddling a necessary agenda. So I think that's the first part of it. And I think it was Mohsin Hamid who said to me some time back that the novel feels even more important today than it did before. And it doesn't matter whether 50 people read it or like millions of people read it, but there's a way of doing it without necessarily stepping on toes, in the way that a journalistic piece or a piece of news might do. But the second thing, Taiba, I think also is that, and for me, this has very much been a process of evolution. And I'm not saying I've mastered it in any way, but I think you do reach a point where you have to start putting yourself on a journey where you're operating agnostic to pleasing everyone. That's never going to happen. And you know that. Like, I had nervousness with the book around what my mother will think of some of the scenes, So I don't want to pretend like it doesn't start from within my home. And especially because, as a girl growing up in Pakistan, you're always labeled with, there's always this, I think it's changing. Of course, it's changing. And for people in privileged positions, it's changing. But yet it's like, you're not meant to ask too many questions, you're not meant to really showcase a mind that works and that sort of thing. So I think with Skyfall, the beauty of it, I think the beauty of fiction in general is that I didn't have to hold a placard to register my protest, and yet I could tell a story that is very intricately bound with things that bother me and, that I want to talk about. So I think somewhere it becomes this very delicate balance, which is not an easy one to strike, I mean, admittedly.
Yeah. Oh, definitely. Yeah. So, Skyfall covers a very wide canvas of, I would say, place and identity. I mean, there's Lahore, there's Kashmir, there's New York, and many other places within those places. So, not from an anthropological point of view, but as an artist, what does belonging mean to you? What does identity mean? How do you negotiate it?
Yeah. I mean, I think, Taiba, I have to be honest and say it feels very nebulous. Like it's something that's very hard to put your finger on. And, I think especially as women of color, you're always kind of wrought with this, or let me say, you're often getting flack for keeping it very front and center in the writing, and it's like, oh, we're pandering to particular tropes and that sort of thing.
Yeah.
But if I'm to talk about my own experiences growing up in Karachi, I think negotiating identity came to me a lot later and a lot more retrospectively, because growing up, I think there was almost this veil, despite the fact that you go to these private schools and you feel like you're educated or whatever that might be. And I think that veil produces a kind of, how should I say this? Like, you're almost beginning to view yourself from the gaze of other people. And unfortunately, in my case, I think, I'm not proud to say this, but it was the gaze of people who are in the West, or people who might typically look upon Pakistan with contempt, as kind of third world or whatever. And at some level, you start internalizing that. And so I think with storytelling, I've begun a more reflexive process, which is like, how can I think about my identity, which of course will involve this negotiation with the West at all times. But is there a way to really think about it beyond these large categories of, that's the West and this is the non-West, and that's brown and that's yellow and that's black and that's white? And funny that you ask about belonging, Taiba, because I feel like that word is so mysterious in some ways, and it's powerful, but also precarious in that we grow up with this quest for belonging and for trying to fit in somewhere. I did, for sure. I mean, I think a lot of other girls who went through a similar trajectory must have. And somehow that quest for belonging always hinges on a validation by a race we think is superior, which is why I think the book talks a lot about passport privilege and trying to reclaim. And I think with writing, it's put me on this journey of trying to reclaim our identity a little bit. And even for me personally, forget about in a literary way, but just to say, can I start thinking about my Pakistani identity, for example, as one of the many identities? Can I think about it as more fluid? Can I become more comfortable with knowing it's flawed, knowing it's vulnerable? And, just can I then use that to carve out a space which is, when I tie back to literature, which is to say, which can put Pakistan as an equal on the map when it comes to storytelling. So I think for me, it's a very nascent kind of process, and it's almost like the Renaissance has just begun. So I don't want to pretend like I've mastered this or accomplished it, but I feel it's hazy and it worries me a lot.
Mm-hmm. So speaking of storytelling, you're a filmmaker, which means you are someone who knows how to navigate the mediums of storytelling. And yet you chose the medium of the novel for this story. My first question is why? And my second question is, do you visualize it as a screenplay, or are you tempted to turn it into one?
Yeah, I mean, Taiba, I think firstly, I find that whatever little experience I've had with filmmaking and with storytelling, or writing, let me say, I feel like those two mediums are definitely conversant. So anything that I've picked up during my shooting on location, I feel it's given me access to neighborhoods and to worlds that I otherwise would not have had, and at the time you may or may not realize it, but it's strangely like a form of travel, even often without getting onto a plane, right? Mm-hmm. And so I think when I came to writing the book, a lot of that got linked in that, let me say that writing is obviously, again, like a very mysterious process. And it's like you're starting from this dark room, like Henry James called it, and you're trying to then fill that room up with light. And for me, I think my experience as a filmmaker really fed into trying to fit those pieces of the puzzle, or trying to illuminate that room. Where do you begin? This story is just in your head, right? Mm-hmm. And it could be little things, Taiba, like while I was filming with these street boys in Liari in Karachi, it could be a stretched moment of silence. It could be an expression in someone's eyes, or it could be a story somebody told you, and somehow that expression will make its way into your writing. But coming to the point about why a book and why not a film on this, I think I was very conscious of, why not anything else? I do so much journalistic writing as well, for example, or research writing, based writing, academic writing. And I think for me, it was almost the fact that the novel has become less popular, funnily worked in my favor. And what I mean with that is that we're in a time where there's this big there's almost this anxiety epidemic, and that's being triggered by the media, right? Which is to say, everything's a big headline, everything's sensational. There's this currency of fear that gets traded. And I think the novel almost gives you a texture and a treatment which I'd like to believe kind of rises above that clutter, above that scrolling syndrome or what's on my news feed. And like I said, fewer people might read it, but the ones who do are likely to really get immersed in it. So I felt like in some ways, so that was the first part of it. And secondly, I also thought fiction really allows you to do this without being an activist shouting from a rooftop. And I don't want to be telling people what to think about my story. I don't want to tell you how to think. You can make what you want of it. But it gives me an opportunity to put out into the universe what I think is bothering me, or what I think is my song, like you said, in the earlier analogy. So I think that's why I chose the medium of fiction. So I think that was your first question. And I think the question on adaptation, well, it's funny because even while writing it, I don't know if this was a good thing or a bad thing, but I visualized so many of those scenes as part of a reel. Now, I don't know whether that's because I've shot and that's part of it, or maybe that it wasn't even that. I think it was just that helps, like having visual crutches helps. And so I feel like, and especially today, Taiba, when I see filmmakers like Asim Abbasi, who've done Churels and Cake, kind of tearing the envelope, pushing it, I would be ecstatic to think of Skyfall, maybe being a web series, ideally, even more than a film, because I think that's where you really have the chance to delve into characters, to even develop the subplot, to develop not just the protagonists. And funnily, I had this very greedy thought of thinking, hey, like I've got the book written now. Do you think I could turn it into a screenplay and direct it? And then like the voice of sanity kind of surged, and because I'm not trained in that kind of filmmaking at all. But that conversation is incidentally happening as we speak with a few OTT platforms. And so it's exciting times, of course, very, very preliminary stages, so nothing major to report, but I'm very hopeful that eventually something like that sees the light of day, because that's the sort of feedback I have had from my early readers as well, to say that, and I think that's always reassuring. But beyond my one book, Taiba, I also do feel that hopefully it moves the needle a little bit just for filmmaking and storytelling from Pakistan, right? To say, can we talk about stories that don't fit a neat mold, or where women are not on either end of the spectrum, but they're actually somewhere in that gray area. So I think that's my bigger sort of aspiration with it, but fingers crossed.
Yeah, no, and that's exciting. I'm really looking forward to it. An adaptation of novel. But since we're on the topic, literary adaptations, they are slippery, delicate ground, right? Yeah. I mean, you have to distill an entire novel into what? 2 hours? Or if you're lucky, 2 hours. Yeah. And, sometimes it's just about that one particular angle, or that refraction of focus on perhaps on a side character, on a secondary storyline, perhaps, or anything that could get ignored by the reader, in the written text. So since we're talking about a hypothetical adaptation over here, and you do have the sensibilities of a filmmaker, what's that crucial element that you would work on for it to stand out visually?
Yeah, well, I mean, I love that question. And I think I love it, Taiba, also because as we were talking about mediums, I was also thinking that, like I've been thinking about it as you think about it practically, right? And you think about OTT, or you think about film. But as we were chatting right now, it just in a really ideal situation, this won't happen. But I was thinking there are so many other forms as well that sort of visual art can take and performance can take. And to me, for example, like, even though, yes, it might be shorter time, but I don't even theater is something that speaks to you, right? Or like, I don't know, even something like dance speaks to me a lot. And I know it's funny to say, like, how do you take a book and turn that into a dance performance? But again, back to your idea of, is there a snippet from it that could be performative in a sense that is less conventional? So first, that, I think will be so exciting for me. But that's obviously going to be harder to happen because it's less conventional. But I think that also has a more organic link to the fact that it's based out of this historical trajectory of the red light area of the dancing girls and things like that. But coming to your point about which part I think is important, or not important, but which I think would be very front and center for me in a visual story with it, I think there would probably be two things there. About one would be the sense of place as far as Lahore goes. And I think that's very important for me because Lahore is a very inner gaze in the novel. It's this very raw, kind of grainy, rough around the edges city. I wasn't looking to clean it up. I wasn't looking to show a version that tourists get to see. Incidentally, with New York, I have done that because that's exactly what she's doing. She is looking at it from the outside. So I think for me, and this is kind of why it makes me jittery, because chances are that to try and get Lahore filmed in Lahore is so much harder unless it happens in a Pakistani, sort of by a Pakistani filmmaker. So I think that's one thing which I would worry about or would want to be captured with as much authenticity as possible, without dumbing down the women, but also without sort of showing the city in an exoticized way. And the second thing I feel, as far as characters go, is that Asher, the character of the Indian filmmaker, because when people read the book, they tend to put Rania, the female protagonist, front and center. And I feel Taiba, as someone who's kind of immersed in the book, you'll understand that Asher is very much the less visible, but sort of the indispensable gravity that's catalyzing the book and her story. And so whoever, if and when, something like this gets made, I would be very keen for that part to really be done in a gentle way and yet a very powerful way, because that can become a tough balance to strike. How are you quietly fierce? How do you remain memorable without grabbing all the airtime? Because we tend to remember the people we see the most. And even with writing, my editor helped me with this a lot, to say, even if there's a tiny character that appears, it shouldn't be that 50 pages down, people are thinking, who was that? So I'm hoping that with the film, and also because the India-Pakistan equation for me is very close to my heart, I really hope that, that justice gets done to that. But there are so many. I think that's just one of them.
Yeah. Oh, that was fun. That was such fun. And I can't believe we are practically out of time. So I think I can only squeeze one more question in, and that's the mandatory question. What would you say in terms of advice to aspiring authors who are setting out on the same path as you?
Yeah, I mean, that's always a tough one, I suppose, but a really important one as well. I think, Taiba, it would probably be the fact that for me, the process has been very experimental. And that's because I don't hail from a typical writing background or trajectory. And it's just something that I've done very much as in the works and learned kind of on the go. And I think I'm very much in the process of still doing that. So I think in terms of just what I would say to someone who's aspiring to do it would be to say, keep that openness, right? Because I think we all, at least I, was always scared of imperfection and always scared of a journey that feels like I don't know what's going to happen from A to Z. And I think with a novel, it's not easy to know that. It's like digging a well, or it's like putting little pieces of a puzzle, or like that light room the dark room we spoke about. And so I think we are at a time where there's this quest for perfection, whether that's online or anywhere. And I know it's easy to sit and say it, but I think it's something I've really started embracing, to say, let the book read as raw as well. Every single page doesn't need to seem over sanitized. It's advice I had got from a published author earlier, and it stayed with me. And I think that's the big advice I give. And the second thing for me, Taiba, is that typically, like even when I was starting out, the inception of an idea and I think the culmination are probably the most exciting parts. Yeah. Where the day I heard that headmaster say the thing about the song, and I'm like, oh, I want to write a book. This is my song. Let's just unearth it. And of course, that sounds like such a great quote and such a great tagline, and it is. But my experience with Skyfall taught me that it's just not enough. And today when the book is on a bookshelf, when I'm seeing it, when I'm interviewing, I'm like, oh, this feels great. But what about that time in the middle? And I don't even think this is just about writing a book. It's about anything that requires, time and investment of energy and effort. And I feel for me, it was that middle time, which would have been the deal breaker. like, had I not kept my head low and exercised a little bit of that self-discipline, which is the completely unglorious part, right? Like, no one's there to pat you on the back. There are no social media updates to put as such. There's no recognition, which is something we as humans crave. But for me, I think if someone can stay that course, that's probably what differentiates a book that reaches the bookshelf from one that sort of stays within your imagination.
Yeah. And one last question. Have you found your song, or is the quest still on?
I think, and I was asked this, I was asked something very similar yesterday at a book talk, and it got me thinking that somebody said, oh, do you have to have one song, or could it be several? Or what if you discover something's your song and then you realize it's not? And I think it's so important to talk about this, because when I heard that quote about the song and about kind of alleviating that quiet desperation that I think I was feeling, or so many of us feel, we're always hustling. It's like you're on a treadmill, you need to get this done, you need to do that. There's always something going on. And with my 2 young daughters, but I think, Taiba, for me, storytelling is probably my song. Now, again, you might talk to me like, we might be doing some interview 5 years later and I'm like, I found another song. So I don't think I want to look at it as like working as something which is an end, or, which is definitive. But I think with storytelling, the beauty of it is that it's varied and assorted enough that I have this large canvas. I've got film, I've got writing, I've got whatever medium you want. I can sit around a campfire and do it. It doesn't have to be something that's published or on like a streaming platform. So I think that's the beauty of storytelling, which is why I think it is my song, because it allows me to paint that canvas with a multitude of views, right? And across so many mediums. And I guess I'm someone who just monotony starts getting to me a little bit. I struggle to do that assembly line kind of thing. So I think with storytelling, like, the diversification is endless, right? It's like as vast as your imagination. So I don't know. I think I have definitely found part of my song. I don't know if it's the only song I'll carry through life, but it's one that I find, speaks to me in both quiet and loud tones, which is exciting.
Those are such inspiring words. Honestly, they really are. But thank you, Saba. It's been absolutely wonderful. Really, it has. And I wish you all the best from here. And I'm looking forward to so much more from you, and definitely waiting for that movie. Definitely.
Thank you, Taiba. Thank you. This has been such an exciting chat. Really one of the highlights of the post-book release. And
oh, wow.
It's been such a great, I think because the questions were just out of the box, for lack of a better word, so I wasn't repeating everything that you're expected to say when you write a book. So thank you so much. And thank you for your generous words about the book and just for being invested in it. I mean, I think that's what every writer hopes for, right?
Thank you. You just made my day.
Thank you. No, I mean every word of it. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Sabas. Take care.
Okay, bye.